4 silver dollars. The quietest rancher in Scorpion Creek bought the caged Apache girl. He was a man who had not spoken a full sentence in town for a year. So why did he just spend his last coin to buy the one person the world had already condemned? What drove this solitary soul to step into the center of a fire everyone else was running from? If you ever felt the urge to do the right thing when everyone else was silent, then comment 1, because this story is for you. It all started with a broken harness. The main leather strap, the one that bore the most strain, had finally given way, snapping with a sound like a dry twig under a boot. For Nathaniel Nate Sterling, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a breach in the wall of his solitude. His ranch, a rugged patch of land pressed against the high, lonely peaks of the San Juan Mountains, was his fortress. Here, the only sounds were the wind in the pines, the soft nickering of his horses, and the rhythmic beat of his own quiet work. For the 5 years since the fever had stolen his wife and son, silence had been his closest companion, a ghost he had learned to live with. He was a man who spoke more to his cattle than to people, a man who found more solace in the honest grain of wood than in the shifting expressions of a human face. His life was a routine of mending, building, and surviving, a quiet penance for a past he could not change. The town of Scorpion Creek, nestled in the dusty valley below, was a place he avoided at all costs. It was a raw, festering wound of a town, built on greed and fear, where the loudest man was king and prejudice was a currency traded as freely as whiskey. The tension between the townsfolk and the Apache tribes whose land this had once been was a constant, low-grade fever, ready to spike at the slightest provocation. Nate, with his quiet ways and his self-imposed exile, was a figure of suspicion. The men who gathered on the porch of the saloon saw his solitude not as a sign of grief, but of weakness or strangeness. They whispered that the mountains had claimed his mind along with his family. He endured their stares and their muttered comments with a stony indifference, his face a mask that hid the deep, quiet well of his sorrow. He had no interest in their world, and he wanted nothing from it but to be left alone. But the broken harness forced his hand. He needed a new strap, and the only place to get one was at the Mercantile in the heart of Scorpion Creek. He rode down from his mountain sanctuary, the clean, crisp air of the high country giving way to the thick, dusty heat of the valley floor. He tied his horse, his movements deliberate and economical, feeling the weight of the town's collective gaze on his back. He was a ghost here, a man out of place, and he felt the familiar urge to finish his business and retreat back to the safety of his silent world. He bought the leather strap, a sack of flour, and a small tin of coffee, exchanging only the necessary words with the shopkeeper, who eyed him with the usual mixture of pity and distrust. His mission was complete. The fortress was waiting. He was about to mount his horse, the scent of the pines already calling to him, when a sound cut through the air, different from the usual clamor of the town. It was the sharp, rhythmic call of an auctioneer, but beneath it was an uglier sound, the hungry, jeering roar of a crowd that had scented blood. It came from the direction of the old grain warehouse, a place usually reserved for livestock sales. Curiosity was not a feeling Nate often indulged, and his first instinct, the one that had kept him safe for years, was to ride away. This was the town's business, the town's cruelty, and it had nothing to do with him. But something held him rooted to the spot. It was a sound of profound inhumanity, a note of despair so deep it resonated with the hollow space in his own chest. Against every instinct for self-preservation, he dropped his horse's reins. He took a step, not toward the trail home, but toward the fire. The heat inside the warehouse was suffocating, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap liquor. A jeering, sweaty crowd of miners and drifters had formed a tight circle around a rusted iron cage. And inside the cage, a young Apache woman sat on the filthy floor, her wrists bound, her face a proud, bruised mask of defiance. Her name, he would learn later, was Ayesha. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like a rusty saw, was extolling her supposed virtues as a savage scout who could be tamed for hard labor. The men in the crowd laughed, their eyes gleaming with a predatory light that made Nate's stomach clench. He saw the raw, chafed skin on her wrists, the dried blood at her temple, and the unyielding fire in her eyes that refused to be extinguished by her captors. She did not look at them. She looked straight ahead, through them, as if they were nothing more than ghosts in her world. Nate felt a cold, familiar rage coil in his gut. The voice of reason, his companion for 5 lonely years, screamed at him to turn back. "This is not your fight," it hissed. "You are one man. Look at them. They are a pack. To interfere is to invite their wrath upon your home, upon your quiet life. Walk away. You cannot save her." He saw the cruel glint in the eyes of the men making bids, saw their callous disregard for the human being in the cage. These were the men of Scorpion Creek, men who understood only strength and coin. He had nothing to offer her, but more trouble, another mouth to feed on a ranch that barely sustained one man's quiet sorrow. He had no plan, no weapon, and no allies. Every instinct for survival, every hard lesson learned from a life of loss, told him to retreat to his mountain and forget what he had seen. But he couldn't. The sight of her, so still and proud amidst such ugliness, stirred something in him he thought was long dead. It was not pity. It was a profound, gut-wrenching sense of recognition. He saw in her unbreakable spirit a mirror of the resilience he had tried to forge in his own grief. She was a lone peak standing against a storm, and he, a man who had made the mountains his only friends, could not abandon her to it. The voice of reason fell silent, drowned out by a force more powerful, a deep-seated conviction that there were lines that could not be crossed, injustices that could not be witnessed in silence. To walk away now would be to betray not just her, but the last shred of the man he had been before the silence took him. The cost of his solitude would become cowardice, and that was a price he was no longer willing to pay. He moved without thinking, a man propelled by a will stronger than his own. He dropped the new harness strap and the sack of flour in the dust. He shrugged off the worn leather coat from his shoulders, his father's coat, the one thing that still held the scent of a happier time, and walked toward the cage. The crowd shifted, murmuring as he passed. He said nothing. He simply leaned down and gently draped the coat over the top of the cage, shielding her from the brutal sun that beat down through the warehouse's broken roof. Her eyes flicked to his for a fraction of a second, a spark of surprise in their dark depths. Then the auctioneer called out again. $5, a man shouted. Nate straightened up, his voice, rough from disuse, cracking the hot, still air. $5, he repeated, louder this time. The crowd erupted in laughter, but Nate didn't hear them. He had just spent his last coin and his only piece of armor, and he had never felt more like himself. If you believe that one act of courage, no matter how small, can ignite a fire, please like this video to spread that spark. The ride out of Scorpion Creek was a journey through a landscape of silent judgment. Nate led his mare, Ayasha walking a few paces behind him, a small, proud figure wrapped in the shadow of his presence. The townsfolk they passed averted their eyes, their silence a thick, suffocating blanket of condemnation. Women pulled their children closer, whispering behind their hands. Men who had once offered a grudging nod now stared at him with open hostility. Nate had not just bought a person. He had violated the town's unspoken code, a fragile set of beliefs that kept the simmering hatred between settlers and Apache from boiling over. By showing compassion to one of them, he had, in their eyes, betrayed his own kind. He was no longer just the strange, grieving recluse from the mountains. He was a traitor, a man who had sided with the enemy. The journey back to his ranch felt longer than usual, the trail steeper, the air heavier. Ayasha did not speak. She moved with a wary, fluid grace, her eyes constantly scanning the rocks and trees, her body a coiled spring of readiness. Nate respected her silence. He knew that words were a poor balm for wounds so deep. When they reached a stream hidden by a grove of cottonwoods, he stopped. He dismounted and, without a word, filled his canteen, then soaked a clean cloth from his saddlebag. He approached her slowly, as one would a wild, cornered animal. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice quiet. He gently took her bound wrists and began to clean the raw, chafed skin where the leather straps had dug into her flesh. She tensed at his touch, but did not pull away. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not gratitude, not yet, but a flicker of surprise, a dawning recognition that this was not the act of an owner, but of a healer. The fragile peace of their shared silence was shattered the moment they reached his ranch. They were not alone. 3 riders were waiting for them, their horses blocking the path to his cabin. At the lead was Jedediah Voss, the town's powerful rancher and the man who had lost the bid for Ayasha. Flanking him were his sneering son, Reed, and a hired man with cold, empty eyes. Voss's face was a mask of self-righteous fury. "Sterling," he boomed, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "You've made a grave mistake. You bring that savage onto this land. You bring a curse on us all. We're here to rectify your error." Nate placed himself between the riders and Ayasha, his hand resting almost unconsciously on the handle of the axe tucked into his saddle. He didn't speak, but his stance was an answer in itself. The tension was a taut wire, ready to snap. This was more than a dispute. It was a challenge to his very existence. He had sought refuge from the world's cruelty, but it had followed him home. Voss and his men represented the rigid, unforgiving judgment of Scorpion Creek, a judgment that saw no room for compassion, no possibility of humanity in someone they had deemed an enemy. "Give her to us, Sterling," Reed sneered. "We'll put her to work where she belongs. Don't be a fool." Nate looked from their hard, hateful faces to the proud, silent woman standing behind him. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, and that this was a fight he could not win with force. But he also knew that to back down now, to surrender her to these men, would be to surrender the last piece of his own soul. He was torn between the instinct for self-preservation and the fierce, protective responsibility he now felt for the woman he had bought for $5. He had thought he was buying her freedom, but he was beginning to realize he had just enlisted in a war. "She is not a stray dog to be handed over," Nate said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the mountains behind him. The words hung in the tense air, a direct challenge to Jedediah Voss's authority. Voss's face darkened, his hand inching toward the pistol at his hip. "You've been alone too long, Sterling," he growled. "Lost your sense. That woman is Apache. Her people burned the Miller homestead last spring. They killed my brother 10 years ago. You think we're just going to let you harbor a viper in our midst?" He was speaking not just to Nate, but to the unspoken fears of the entire valley, stoking the embers of old hatreds. Reed, his son, spat on the ground. "We'll take her, old man. One way or another." The threat was clear. This was no longer just about one woman. It was about enforcing the brutal, unwritten law of the frontier. The confrontation felt like it was moving in slow motion. The wind whispered through the pines, a mournful sound. Nate knew he was on the precipice of a violence he could not win. He could see the cold certainty in their eyes. He was about to raise the axe, to make a final, desperate stand, when the first twist in the story unfolded. It came not from him, but from behind him. Ayasha stepped forward, moving from his shadow into the open space between them. She held up her bound hands, not in surrender, but as a statement. She looked directly at Jedediah Voss, and for the first time since the cage, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was as clear and sharp as splintered stone. "The men who burned the Miller homestead," she said in perfect, unaccented English, "wore the boots of white men. I saw them. I followed their tracks for 2 days before your posse found me." A stunned silence fell over the small clearing. Voss stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Reed's sneer faltered. Her words had struck them like a physical blow, a truth so unexpected it shattered their righteous narrative. "You're a liar," Voss finally managed, but his voice lacked conviction. Ayasha's gaze did not waver. "Your brother," she continued, her eyes locking onto his, "did not die in a raid. He died in a card game in Durango, cheated by a man named Silas Blackwood. I was there. I cleaned the tables at the saloon. I saw the cards. I heard the gunshot." Every word was a perfectly aimed stone, dismantling the foundation of hatred upon which Voss had built his power. The reversal was stunning. This savage they had come to claim was not a mindless animal. She was a witness. She was the holder of their ugly, hidden truths. The men were speechless. Their fury, once so potent, now looked like the blustering of guilty children. Nate lowered his axe, his heart pounding. He had been prepared to fight for her, but she had just armed herself with something far more powerful than any weapon: the truth. She had turned their prejudice into a weapon against them. "You ride away now," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. "And these stories stay in these mountains. You do not, and the sheriff in Durango will hear a new version of how your brother died." If you were Jedediah Voss, his lies exposed by the very person he came to persecute, what would you do? Tell us your reaction in the comments below. Voss looked from her unyielding face to his son, then to the silent, watching trees. Without another word, he yanked on his horse's reins and galloped away, his posse trailing behind him like whipped dogs. They had come for a savage, but they had been defeated by a woman who remembered everything. The dust settled, leaving an ringing silence in its wake. The immediate threat was gone, but the confrontation had changed everything. Ayesha was no longer a silent, passive victim. She was a woman who had demonstrated a formidable strength, armed with a sharp mind and a memory that held the town's darkest secrets. Nate looked at her with a newfound awe. He had tried to be her shield, but she had just proven that her own armor was far stronger than his. The balance between them had shifted. They were no longer a rescuer and the rescued. They were allies, two solitary figures bound together by a shared enemy and a truth that was now dangerously exposed. They both knew Voss would not let this go. Humiliated men were dangerous men, and Voss had been stripped bare in front of his own son. Retaliation was not a question of if, but when. That night, a tense watchfulness settled over the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded like an approaching threat. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, not one of caution, but of shared strategy. Later, as Nate oiled his rifle by the firelight, Ayesha approached him. She held out a small, intricately beaded pouch. "My people have a saying," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The snake you spare in the grass is the one that bites your heel in the dark." Voss will not forget. She was right. They couldn't just wait for him to strike. The moral high ground was a cold comfort when you were outnumbered and isolated. She then made an unexpected request, a moral challenge that would test the very foundation of their fragile alliance. "There is a place," she said, her eyes meeting his across the flickering light, "a canyon 2 days' ride from here. A hidden passage known only to my people. It leads west, over the mountains, to safety. But the trail is treacherous, and we must travel at night. I can lead us, but I cannot do it alone. I need you to trust me, not as the man who bought me, but as a partner. You must follow my lead, listen to my counsel, and walk a path you cannot see." This was her challenge to him. She was asking him to relinquish the control and authority that his role as a white man and a landowner automatically gave him, and to place his life entirely in her hands. He would have to follow the savage scout, trusting her knowledge of the land over his own. It was a complete reversal of the power dynamic they had started with. This was the point of no return. To agree meant abandoning his ranch, his fortress, the only home he had known, and venturing into a wilderness where he was the outsider, the one who was blind. To refuse meant waiting for a violence that was sure to come. The choice was between the illusion of safety and a dangerous, uncertain trust. He looked at her, at the steady confidence in her eyes, and saw not a former captive, but a leader. He thought of the life he had lived, a life of silent retreat, of letting the world happen to him. She was offering him a different path, not one of retreat, but of active, courageous survival. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Show me the way," he said. And in that moment, he wasn't just agreeing to a journey. He was agreeing to a new way of being, a partnership where strength was not defined by race or gender, but by wisdom and trust. The fire crackled, casting their long shadows on the wall, two figures about to step into the darkness together. Their journey began under the cloak of a moonless night, two ghosts slipping away from a life that was no longer safe. They traveled light, carrying only what they needed: water, a little food, Nate's rifle, and Ayesha's intimate knowledge of the land. She led them through dry riverbeds and tangled thickets, her movements silent and sure, reading the terrain like a language Nate had never learned. He followed without question, his respect for her growing with every mile they covered. He, the man of the mountains, was now a student, and she, the woman from the cage, was his guide. This journey was not just a flight from danger. It was a pilgrimage, stripping away the old roles the world had assigned them and forging a new one based on mutual reliance. On the second night, as they navigated a narrow pass between two towering stone bluffs, the night exploded. A rifle shot cracked the silence, echoing off the canyon walls. The pack mule screamed and reared, its legs snapping in a rut. They were being hunted. Off the trail. Now, Nate commanded, his voice low and urgent. They scrambled into the rocks, hooves thundering behind them, the taunts of Voss and his men cutting through the darkness. Ayasha led them up a steep, treacherous ridge, a wall of crumbling rock and thorny brush. "Climb," she said, pointing to a narrow ledge above. "I can't make it," Nate gasped, his hand going to his old war wound, a familiar ache blooming in his side. "Step on my back," she commanded, crouching low. He hesitated for a second, then did as he was told, his heavy boot pressing into her shoulder as she braced herself, her strength astonishing him. She got him to the ledge, and together they collapsed in the dust, their breath ragged, their hearts pounding. Below them, the hunters' voices echoed, searching, but for now, they were safe. It was then, in that moment of shared peril and exhaustion, that the story's most powerful twist unfolded. Nate reached into his coat and pulled out the crumpled, yellowed piece of paper he had carried since the auction, the bill of sale. It was the legal document that made her his property, the symbol of his role as her rescuer. He looked at it under the faint starlight, then at her. Without a word, he tore it into small pieces and let them flutter away on the wind, like scattered ash. "You are not owned," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Not saved, not bought. You are free, and no man will ever say he gave you that." Ayasha stared at him, her eyes glistening. She reached out and laid her fingers gently on the back of his hand, not in gratitude, but in profound recognition. In that single act, he had destroyed the last remnant of their old power dynamic. They were now, truly, equals. Just as dawn broke, they were cornered. Voss's men had them trapped in a narrow gulch. A bloody, hopeless shootout seemed inevitable, but as Voss's men raised their rifles, a new sound echoed through the canyon, the steady clip-clop of a mule. The town's sheriff, Amos Kane, rode into the gulch, flanked not by a posse, but by two grim-faced men in dark suits. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff commanded. "These men represent the Civil Rights Court. You harm that woman, you violate Federal Statute 241. Voss and his men stared in disbelief. They had come to enforce their own brutal law, but they were defeated by a new one, a law that recognized Ayasha not as property, but as a person. The community of law had triumphed over the mob of prejudice. If you believe that justice, no matter how slow, will always find its way, share this video. Let the world know that true strength lies in law and liberty, not in hatred. 6 months later, the ranch was reborn. The air, once heavy with silence and sorrow, now smelled of fresh-turned earth, baking bread, and the sweet scent of the sunflowers Ayasha had planted along the fence line. She had brought the place back to life, not just with her hard work, but with her spirit. She had repaired the fences, balanced the books, and stitched new curtains that let the morning light flood into the once dim cabin. But her greatest work was not on the ranch. Twice a week, she rode to a small Apache settlement nestled in the foothills, bringing slates, chalk, and stories to the children who had been left behind by the world. The girl from the cage had become a teacher, a beacon of hope. Nate watched it all, a man slowly emerging from a long, dark winter. The hollow ache in his chest had been filled with a quiet, steady warmth. He taught her to read, and in return, she taught him to live again. One morning, he called her out to the porch. On the table lay a single sheet of parchment, the ink still glistening. It was the deed to the entire ranch, the land, the livestock, the water rights, everything. "This is yours," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "This place is only alive because of you. I didn't save you, Ayasha. You saved yourself, and you saved me, too. You earned this." Tears streamed down her face, the first he had ever seen her shed. They were not tears of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming recognition. "Thank you," she whispered, "not for saving me, but for seeing me." This was never a story about a man buying a woman's freedom. It was a story about two people finding their own, together. It was about a quiet man who found his voice to stand against injustice, and a strong woman who reclaimed her own story from the ashes of cruelty. They were married in the spring, not in a church, but in the garden she had grown, surrounded by wildflowers and the children whose lives she had touched. Their vows were not spoken in front of a preacher, but in the quiet, steady gaze they shared, a promise of a future they would build as equals. What does it mean to be free? Is it a paper signed, a price paid? Or is it the moment someone sees you, truly sees you, and stands beside you? If this story of courage, dignity, and love has stirred your soul, then you have found your tribe. Subscribe to Mr. Storytelling, where we believe the most powerful tales of the Old West are not about the gunslingers, but about the quiet heroes who had the courage to heal, to build, and to love.